Okay, so greetings to everyone. I welcome you to the second webinar of the webinar series organized by the Association for Social Economics. The aim of the webinar series is to support junior scholars in publishing their research, a very important part of their professional career and their contribution to science, policy, and society. My name is Asimina Christoforou. I am a trustee of the ASC Executive Council and assistant editor of the Forum for Social Economics, which, along with the Review of Social Economy, are the two journals published by the ASC. For this webinar, I will be your coordinator. Today, Professor Paolo Ramazzotti, managing editor of the Forum for Social Economics, will present a topic on policy-related research. Just to brief you about the process, the webinar will be separated in two parts. We begin with a presentation and then we move on to the Q&A part. In the Q&A part, the audience will have the chance to share questions and comments on the topic of our discussion by raising hands or sending a chat message. If during the presentation you have quick, simple questions of clarification, please do raise hands or send me a chat message, but I kindly ask to save detailed questions and comments for the Q&A session after the presentation. Before we move on to the presentation, it is with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Amitava Dutt, Managing Editor of the Review of Social Economy. He will share with us a few words about the Association for Social Economics. Amitava?
Thank you, Asimina, for starting us off. I must clarify, we don't have a managing editor for ROSE. That's the Review of Social Economy. We have 4 co-editors, and 2 of my colleagues are here, Lisa Herzog in name and Roberto Veneziani, who started us off at the last session. Is here too, by face and name. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that this is an effort by the Association for Social Economics and of the 2 journals that are associated with it to help young scholars, as Asimina mentioned, help them with some knowledge of how to get publications in general, and that was the topic that Roberto covered mainly. And this is one of the ASE, the Association for Social Economics's activities. Association for Social Economics is been an association for many years now, and it is mainly interested in looking at the economy from a perspective which emphasizes social and political aspects and not narrowly economic aspects, and is also particularly concerned with ethical issues. And nobody here claims to be a scientist who is value free. So now, students are very much encouraged to be members of the association, and we have membership fees, of course, but our membership fees for students is actually $20 a year, as compared to the standard membership of $50. So you might consider doing that. We give various kinds of awards and as well as funding for research and so on. And so if you're interested in socio-political issues about the economy and emphasize values, then I would really encourage you to think about the association and go to its website, which is socialeconomics.org, or just search for Association for Social Economics. We're going to have another workshop on April 30th, which will focus on interdisciplinary research and how it relates to the review of social economy. And that will be um, presented by Lisa, myself, and another one of our colleagues. So please make a note of that as well. Thank you very much. Paolo, all yours. I have to unmute you.
I think you have to allow me to upload my my
Right,
PowerPoint.
exactly. Can you do it?
I think so, yes. I'll have to. I'm not sure. Oh, I see. Hold on. Okay, do you see it? Yes? Okay. Yes. So thank you for being here. Let me begin with a preliminary remark. The invitation to this webinar stated that, oops. How is this supposed to? Oh no, I'm afraid I got it wrong. Okay. The invitation to this webinar stated that there would be a presentation on how to reasonably deal with economy, economics, social economics, economic research, and economic policy. Now, I do hope that you felt that I wanted to be a bit self-ironic, because I invite you not to expect an all-encompassing set of instructions on how to carry out research. The aim is less ambitious and definitely less fun than Woody Allen's famous movie on a more crucial topic, which, as you may recall, is everything you wanted to know. You always wanted to know about sex, but were afraid to ask. So this said, let's move on to social economics and try to understand what we mean by this term. And by social economics, I refer to economic issues that affect the quality of life. And this encompasses a great deal of issues. It is somewhat surprising that so many issues are not taken into account in economic research or somehow downplayed by a great deal of economists. What do they include? Well, first of all, the social rights that are listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The third part of the declaration lists these rights, and I think that this is a very good starting point to understand what we are talking about. But it's not just the Declaration of Human Rights. One might look, for instance, at the 2030 Agenda of the United Nations that deals with hunger, primary education, gender equality and empowerment of women, child mortality, maternal health, a series of diseases, of dramatic diseases, environmental sustainability, partnership, and development. But then there are even more issues that we could list: output, employment, distribution, working conditions, gender, race, religious, and national discrimination, climate and environment issues, biological rights, peace and democratic deliberation, development, capabilities as they are defined and discussed by scholars such as Amartya Sen or Martha Nussbaum or many others. When one looks at this list of issues that affect the quality of life, one is forced to acknowledge that these same issues affect and are affected by society. And this is, I believe, an important point that we should keep in mind: the fact that we cannot discuss economics as if it was a closed system. Indeed, economics refers to the economy, and as one of the participants to this webinar has had an opportunity to say in a similar webinar, economists very often discuss about the economy, but may have a hard time defining it. Now, I'm not going to define the economy. What I do wish to point out is that the economy is variously defined. It may be considered as a set of activities associated to the provisioning of goods and services, to the link between society and nature that allows the former's material reproduction, a set of social relations associated both to provisioning and to material reproduction. Those who are in this kind of literature may feel that some bells are ringing. Fred Lee, who was an American economist who died only a few years ago, liked to emphasize the notion of provisioning. The link between society and nature is emphasized by Karl Polanyi. The notion of social relations associated to the material reproduction of society is a typical Marxian theme. So we have a great variety of definitions, but what I think that they have in common is that the economy may include markets, but it is in no way reducible to markets. And this is, I think, a major issue that we want to keep in mind when we deal with social economics. The second issue that I think is important, which does not emerge from these definitions, but which I think is very important, is that the economy is a social construct. It is created by people, and people can change it. Obviously, it is not something that you change with a fairy's wand. It is not something that you change by magic. It requires an understanding of how the economy works. But it is very important to keep in mind that it is not something that comes out of nature and that cannot be changed. Now, in the attempts to understand how the economy functions, we are faced with different views of the economy, with what I call economic controversies. There are various schools of thought, and I think it is important for whoever wants to deal in general with economics, but even more with social economics, is to acknowledge that there are many schools of thought, and that generally they are distinguished into mainstream and heterodox schools of thought. There is an asymmetry here because the heterodox schools of thought typically distinguish between their heterodoxy and the mainstream, whereas mainstream scholars often tend to consider that their view of the economy is the only scientific way to deal with the economy and tend to neglect heterodox approaches. Nevertheless, a distinction is worth making, and in general, one refers to the mainstream as the scholars who belong to the neoclassical and Austrian market-centered views, whereas heterodox schools, which are more varied, include post-Keynesians, original institutional economics, Marxists, and what all these schools have in common is their greater emphasis on institutions relative to prices in the coordination of the economy. And indeed, the issue is whether and how coordination makes it possible to pursue social goals. This is a major issue that we find in discussions concerning social issues. But truly, when we look at what goes on in economics, there is not just this distinction between mainstream and heterodox schools of thought. What we see is a multifariousness of economic research, which includes a variety of fields of inquiry, such as, for instance, behavioral economics, experimental economics, neuroeconomics, agent-based economics, game theory in its various sub-fields, network analysis, and many others, truly. Now, these apparently, and probably according to some colleagues of mine, are distinct fields of research. Now, truly, they are obviously, to some extent, they tend to be self-contained in the sense that if you deal with behavioral economics, you tend to specialize in that field of inquiry. Now, the issue from our perspective is to understand their relevance. And their relevance, just as the relevance of many other issues in economics, can be assessed in various ways. Doubtless, we have some techniques, and techniques may be very useful to understand issues. Sometimes they may lead to very abstract models, which are used as thought experiments. It doesn't really matter that they can be operationalized. They may not, whoever devises them may consider them just as precisely thought experiments and nothing else. And that's fine if it helps people to understand something, if it provides insights. What is risky is that is the attempt to apply these techniques to the real world without really understanding to what extent they are reliable techniques or models that have to do with reality. And indeed, the cartoon is helpful in pointing this out, where the horse says, did you ever consider working in other factors like, say, reality? And the answer is, and ruin a perfectly good economic theory? Don't be silly. Relevance applies not only to techniques and insights, but to social economics as such. And again, the cartoon, I think, is very helpful. One man says the fundamentals of the economy are good. And the other man replies, but I'm not earning enough to survive. And after thinking a bit, the other one says, that isn't one of the fundamentals. So again, the issue is what is relevant? What is part of the fundamentals? And going back to the distinction I made before about schools of thought, I think that relevance relates also to the coordination issue, not only to existing coordination, but to potential coordination. Because if the issue is to change the economy in order to meet specific social goals, well, we have to conceive of an economy that is somehow coordinated in a different way. And this is an important issue because if I may be a bit extreme and paraphrase Karl Marx, he referred to philosophers, but I tend to say that many economists have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And in saying that the point is to change it, I'm not raising a political issue. Obviously, there is a political issue involved, but it is the economic policy issue that is important. What coordination is possible for what economy and for what society? This is the key issue, I believe. Now, in this perspective, we have different types of policies and different ways to conceive of coordination. If we look at mainstream policies, the main issue is that social goals are acknowledged most often. But the important issue about them is that they affect allocative efficiency. And so the issue is that they must be consistent with market values in one way or another. At the very least, you have to point to a trade-off, which means, yes, you can succeed in meeting some social goals, but at the cost of efficiency, of allocative efficiency. And the cartoon here suggests, the first part says, welfare doesn't work because it gives poor people an incentive to stay poor. And this is basically the philosophy underlying welfare to work. And well, the second part is a bit more ironic. Instead, let's give the wealthy a huge tax cut. Then the poor will have an incentive to become millionaires. Now, aside from the funny part of the cartoon, the emphasis goes to the term incentive. And incentive is always in the sense of relative prices. This is what the mainstream has in mind. What about heterodox policies? Well, in this case, it is social goals that affect societal conditions, that is to say, the way society works. And in this perspective, economic policy involves societal change through institutional change. Now, since I've already mentioned institutions a few times, let me provide you with a rough and ready definition. Institutions are systems of established and embedded social rules that structure social interactions. This is a definition provided by Jeff Hodgson, and I think it may help to understand what we refer to when we speak about institutions. In vague ways. Now, why is it important to define it here? Because if I refer to institutional change, we have different views of institutional change. The mainstream view is that institutions must ensure compatibility with price coordination. They must be compatible in the sense that either they make up for what are usually called market failures, or they must either solve market failures or make up for them. But they are always functional to price coordination. In a heterodox view, institutional change involves a change in the way that the economy is coordinated in one way or other. And this may include prices. Let us move on to a further issue that arises when we discuss policy, and it has to do with complexity. Complexity is a big issue. What is important is that it should not be confused with complications. There's much more to complexity. And what I'm concerned with is stressed by another important economist, John Maynard Keynes, who made this the following statement: "The theory of economics does not furnish a body of settled conclusions immediately applicable to policy. It is a method rather than a doctrine, an apparatus of the mind, a technique of thinking which helps its possessor to draw correct conclusions." Now, the relevance of this statement is that it allows us to focus on two views of policy. The conventional view, which actually crosses schools of thought, because you find it most everywhere, is that actually theory is a doctrine. So you have abstract theory, and then you have to fill up the empirical details in order to figure out what the policy is. Empirical details means that policy in the United States right now may be different from policy in Mexico, but also that policy in the United States right now may be different from what it was 6 months ago, because some of the details have changed. The alternative view, which is what Keynes has in mind, is that theory is a conceptual tool. So you do have abstract theories, but then you need general knowledge, historical and empirical evidence, experience, intuition, judgment. And all of these elements actually allow you to devise a policy. It is not enough to have a nice model or the outcome of some econometric model to say, so now we have a policy. Basically, what all this amounts to, all the things that I've been saying boil down to, is that there is no single view of the economy, no single view of society, no single social end, no single theory, and no single policy. This implies that choosing what is relevant involves value judgments. Now, this may to some extent appear trivial, but it is often forgotten. And I think people should be aware of their value judgments, let alone inform others. But being aware of what they actually are in a more or less implicit way doing is important. As a part of complexity of policy, there is the fact that there is no single approach to policy. And indeed, we are faced with various approaches, which again, are to some extent legitimate from a general point of view, but we should be aware of what we are actually doing and saying. One approach to policy is what Keynes called the die-hard conservatives. Change is wrong. And here we have Ludwig von Mises, who is a major authority in this field. All varieties of interference with the market phenomena not only fail to achieve the ends aimed at by their authors and supporters, but bring about a state of affairs which, from the point of view of their authors and advocates' valuations, is less desirable than the previous state of affairs which they were designed to alter. In other words, if you try to change matters, you're going to make them even worse than they are right now. So this is one approach that we're often faced with. Another approach is what Keynes called the party of catastrophe. According to this approach, change is basically impossible, at least for the time being. We have to wait for something to happen, for possibly people to get so fed up of the system to set up a revolution. And in the time being, I guess we can just sit down and wait. Then there's a third approach, which I call the approach of the short-term pragmatists, who acknowledge that they have to somehow come to terms with their opponents and choose a common ground. What do I mean by this? Well, we can think of, for instance, market-centered policies, which are advanced by the majority of economists and of the political spectrum, and socially centered policies, which are advanced by social economists, by usually progressive economists. So if we see these two areas, there is an overlap. And this is the overlap that allows for pragmatic compromise. Now, there is nothing wrong with this. And indeed, there are many cases where a pragmatic compromise is appropriate. I mean, I think that most economists might agree on a carbon tax, which is basically a PIGU tax, a very mainstream sort of policy action. Or they might agree on recent monetary policy in some countries, which has been very expansionary, even though the background, the theoretical backgrounds are different. There is a problem, however, and it is that challenging opponents on their own playing field may be good, but there is a risk of subordinating social goals to dominant power relations. And this is what the cartoon suggests, where the two individuals are discussing slavery. One says slaves are property, the other slaves are people. Slaves are an economic incentive for plantation owners to produce cotton, which benefits society. Well, in that case, let's just balance slaveholders' rights with human rights. Okay, this is a case where challenging opponents on their own playing field leads to subordinating social goals to dominant power relations. Having provided this outline of possible approaches, you might ask, what do I have in mind? Well, I have no rigorous solution, but I do believe that we may distinguish, following Mark Toole, a major institutionalist economist, distinguish between ends and ends in view. Ends are what we have in mind when we think about a possible civilization. Here is another quote from Keynes. A possible civilization is what we think might be a better world. Ends in view are the possible day-by-day actions towards such a civilization. And this means that, this does not mean that we will have a tranquil and quiet move on towards a better world. There may be conflict, there may be maybe even a revolution, who knows? But the point is that if we want to change matters, we have to look at day-by-day actions to change the world. And obviously, identifying ends and identifying ends in view, following what I said, ultimately means that we have to have a view of what we have in mind. And quoting Gunnar Myrdal, a Swedish economist, there is no view without a viewpoint. And I think it is important that we keep this in mind. Now, having said all this, how does this apply to the journal I work for, the Forum for Social Economics? Well, I think that the rule that probably you've been told already, but that you should keep in mind, is that if you want to publish in a journal, the best thing to do is, well, possibly read it a bit to see what kind of articles are published on it. But then also read its aims and scope. Now, the aims and scope of the forum point out that the forum is concerned with papers that deal with the factual features of the socioeconomic problems of our age and how they impact on a reasonable understanding of the world we live in. It then says that it accepts papers with alternative perspectives on measures and models of socioeconomic performance. Finally, it points out that it is concerned with policy issues with an emphasis on how collective agents affect coordination, cooperation, performance, and so on. And collective agents in this case are not just the conventional policy actor, i.e. governments, but also public agencies, unions, and other private groups and organizations. Okay, this is about it. Thank you very much. This is all.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Thank you for a stimulating presentation. So I guess now I would like to invite our guests to participate with questions and comments if they would like to ask something with regard to the topic of our discussion. If I may use my privilege as the coordinator, maybe I can start with the question. For me, when I was a young scholar myself, my struggle was dealing with challenges that had to do with working in a non-mainstream field, but within a predominantly mainstream world. So maybe the editors of the journals have something to contribute to our young scholars about this. Thank you very much.
Maybe Amitava wants to begin?
Well, this is supposed to be Paolo's day, but maybe I will say a few words about it. Well, most educational institutions, universities, and so forth, at least the major ones, are mainstream without knowing what that means. And however, it should be admitted that within the mainstream, there are various, let us say, variations. I mean, it goes all the way from the University of Chicago economics department to many others, which deal with inequality, uh, capabilities, all kinds of things. So one is to find an area that the mainstream has some interest in and work in that. But I mean, I think Asamina's question also, she didn't ask it this way, is also how to get a job, right? We need jobs, right? And not only get it, but to get tenure. Now, even if the leading departments of economics are very mainstream, despite some cracks in it or differences in it, there are many, many other institutions, places outside of economics as such. See, even University of Chicago, there are many progressive economists in, of all places, the business school. Okay, this is also true at Harvard. Um, but you don't have to aim for those. There are many, many places, smaller colleges, liberal arts colleges, some universities, unfortunately, very few, that you can find jobs in. And there is now an increasing number of journals, of which ours are two, but there are quite a few others, which these places that I mentioned actually value in terms of publications. Of course, they're also concerned about rankings, uh, but you have to decide if you want to be famous, you should be mainstream. If you want to change the world and get a job and live comfortably, but help improve society, I would say you should think about important areas of work where you can publish, where you can get jobs, you can get tenure, and so forth. But again, all of us collectively can change what the mainstream looks like, which is, of course, not for any one of us to do, and certainly not young scholars right from the start, but it's something we can aim to do, not just in economics, but also spreading the boundaries of economics to other issues like uh, social issues or sociology or political issues or philosophical issues. But we'll be talking about some of these things in the next session, so I won't go into them. So there is a lot of wiggle room, let us say, to do important and interesting things, and not just follow the latest fashions and aim for the top journals by somebody's rankings. Thank you.
Thank you for your words of wisdom, Amitava. Paolo, would you like to say something?
Well, I think one of the things that I see in the heterodox field among scholars who try to pursue a different way of acting on the economy and acting in economics is very often an emphasis on the drawbacks of the mainstream, which I think is not very fruitful. By all means, economic inquiry involves a great many things. So you might end up being focusing on the shape of a consumption curve and end up believing that it is a crucial issue. But I do believe that an effort should be made to advance understanding of actual issues, of practical issues, rather than focusing on what is wrong with the mainstream. I think for a long time, a lot of heterodox economists have stressed that the mainstream does not take this into account, it does not take that into account. Now, this is all true. I would simply say, okay, since it does not take those things into account, you take them into account, carry on your research, and point to the issues rather than to the theoretical idiosyncrasies of the mainstream. I think this would be maybe helpful. It may be helpful because a lot of mainstream scholars may be unable to discuss on methodological and sometimes even on theoretical grounds. They may be concerned with issues that are in the realm of social economics. I mean, inequality is an issue that many mainstream economists are concerned with. And I think that if you approach the issue, the inequality from your specific perspective and provide some insights, even mainstream economists may end up saying, well, that's interesting. You didn't model it. You didn't provide a mathematical model for it, but it works. It makes sense. And this may be a way to deal with the issue you raised, Simina.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Your insights were very valuable. Maybe from our audience, the younger scholars might like to give their experience with trying to find a job or publishing. Maybe if you allow me one final question. The other day, I was having a seminar with my students on how to prepare their assessments and write their papers for the course. And I had a student that asked me, will you upload a sample of an assessment so that we can be able to follow it? And I was surprised by this request because I'm thinking that there is no real recipe on how to write a paper, that you have to put a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and then you have your paper. I tried to explain to her that you have to, there is a certain structure, but you have to use your imagination and your insights and your experience of how to write a paper by reading as many papers as you can. I think people don't read as much anymore to be able to have some kind of structure or sample in their head. So I'm thinking when you receive papers or when we write papers, by standardizing the structure, does that stifle the imagination of authors? What would you suggest that authors do? Thank you.
Amitava, do you care to reply? Or?
Well, why don't you go?
Okay. Yes. We often receive at the forum papers that are made according to a standard procedure. Introduction, literature review, model, discussion, conclusion. Now, aside from the quality of the specific paper, the impression is that, as Simina said, the literature review is just a collection of things that have been said on a certain topic without really having thought about what the topic actually is. I mean, let's go back to inequality. I can find a great deal of literature on inequality and I can summarize it. But then what is my value added? My value added means that I have to make sense of that literature and decide that paper A may be very important from various perspectives, but from my perspective, from the perspective of what I'm trying to understand, it is irrelevant. So I should simply do away with it, or in a way, point out that it is not relevant. And another piece of literature may be much more relevant, even though it is not in an important paper or written by an important author. And I should be able to highlight its importance. Quite to the contrary, I see a lot of summaries, but no real understanding of what the author really wants to deal with. And the result is that the models tend to be fairly standard econometric models, which have very little explanation for the variables that are chosen, for the structure of the model that is used. Very often, I believe, very little understanding of the assumptions underlying an econometric model. And owing to this, you end up with very weak conclusions. Now, this is the result of a training that students have that is very scientific. It has a view of economics as something natural. And so something that you can measure very easily and that you can draw conclusions from very easily, much like in the conventional view of policy that I mentioned before. I do not believe that economics is like that. I think that, as Asimina, you said, you have to read a lot. And you have to read a lot, not only about economics, you have to read a lot in general. When I was a graduate student, there was a seminar by a prominent Italian economist. And he said, read a lot, read novels, read literature, read anything, but read. And indeed, I have had in various occasions a chance to say, if you want to understand something about, if you want to understand something about aspects of the Brazilian economy, maybe Jorge Amado may be much more fruitful than an essay in economics. And the same may apply to other authors. I just got Jorge Amado in my mind right now, but many other authors may be important. When we speak about development, I often happen to mention Chinua Achebe, who is a Nigerian author who would have deserved the Nobel Prize in literature, but did not succeed. And again, the importance of these novels is not that they provide you with a full-fledged economic explanation of what is going on, but they do provide you with with insights that will allow you to see the links between some very specific economic theories and what is around there. In other words, put some flesh on the bones. This is basically what I had in mind when I made my preliminary remark. There is no explaining how to write a paper in economic policy. There is no model for that. you have to understand what the issues are, what is involved. And this, going back to what you said before, implies trying to read a lot. Now, in many countries, there may be problems with reading because the economics literature is expensive. And in many universities, it is not easy to access all of the literature. Nevertheless, there is quite a bit of literature that circulates on the internet. Some journals are online, and especially in the heterodox economics field, you do find, well, just to mention some competitors of ours, the review, the Real World Economics Review, which is online and which provides important Amitava spoke about joining the Association for Social Economics. Well, by joining the association, one is entitled to accessing both of the journals of the association. Now, I do not want to claim that our journals are the best in the world. They definitely are, but they definitely provide insights into the literature and provide some information and allow junior scholars to understand what may be worth investigating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. Only to add that in some countries, the literature is not only expensive, but sometimes it is even censored. So in some countries, freedom of speech is not as given as it is in others. So Amitava, your insights?
Well, maybe I can say something and also ask for Paolo's views on this. Both our journals and the society has the name social, right? And from the papers we sometimes receive, it's not clear what social means. In fact, it's not clear to anybody, for that matter, what social really means. But let me just mention a few things that it is not, at least as far as I'm concerned. Well, they are social, but it's not the way we mean social. One is that if you have an economic model or an econometric model, just having a variable which happens to be outside narrowly defined economics is not really social. I mean, there has to be a broader understanding. Not to say that we'll reject papers that do this, but just putting in something that's like social, either as what some people love to say, dependent or independent variable, is not enough. Second, um, there are, of course, mainstream economists who like to uh, use the so-called tools of economics to study everything. Uh, of course, this comes primarily from a gentleman whose name is Gary Becker and his followers. Now, this is what is called economic imperialism. Okay, and it's not to say that using optimization destroys everything. There are clearly is a room for that, but we don't have in mind, most of us, just economic imperialism. Use some tools of economics to analyze everything from marriage to divorce to even suicide, and so on. A third thing is that social is not just about some sector which is called social sector. Now, again, I'm not sure what that means. I mean, some people talk of cooperatives or some sort of social solidarity sectors and things like that. Uh, it's fine to think of it that way. And there are interesting papers that can deal with these so-called social sectors, but we have a much broader interpretation of, I think what Paolo mentioned is this view whole of society and what contributions social looking at the social might mean. I'd like to ask Paolo, if I may, what he thinks. I mean, these are negative things, perhaps, which is not to exclude them, but not to focus only on those. But I'd like to get Paolo's view also about what kinds of papers he is looking for. Could it just be having some social variable in it, or could it be, let's look at things from an economics perspective or a social sector? Can Paolo, maybe you can say something about what you are looking for rather than what maybe you should not avoid, but not only focus on.
Yes, I think that the issues you raised have to do very much with um, a mainstream approach to social issues that we could summarize in this way. It is an additive approach. That is to say, there is economics plus social issues plus something, political issues plus something else. There is the economy, and then there's institutions. We add them on, and so on. This is the additive approach. And why is it an additive approach? Because the mainstream is, to use a bit more technical words, is a closed, conceives of the economy as a closed system. That is to say, a system which does not interact with its surrounding environment, be it social or economic or natural. And it therefore considers that there are rules of the economy that are always there, that do not change, and the economy always functions basically in the same way unless some exogenous event interferes with the rules of behavior of the economy, rules of functioning of the economy. I believe that an approach that adequately takes account of social issues, an approach that views the economy as an open system. That is to say, a system that interacts with society, which means, as I hinted at during my presentation, that the economy affects the social environment. That is the way of living of people, the quality of life of people. But the quality of life of people means that it affects the way society is organized, the way people interact in society, not only in their economic relations. And this feeds back on economic relations. If we look at our economies, we see this constantly. We see that if people are forced to work, to have 2 jobs in order to get to the end of the month, they're obviously unable to have social relations. And if they do not have social relations, they eventually have problems, have psychological problems, have family problems. It is no coincidence that just to mention one event that one might actually to some extent consider exogenous, that the shutdown in Italy at least has led to a rise in feminicides, in women killed within the households, because what happens outside affects what happens to people, and how people interact eventually affects the way society is organized. Now, this is, I think, what is important. And if we think of it this way, we understand that the imperialism of mainstream economics is based on a very narrow view of social interaction, in general, of interaction among people, because it is basically a price-centered view, where the price may be a shadow price or an explicit price, but it is always a price. An open systems view conceives of many more elements that affect the behavior of people. I hope I answered.
If I could just add one point to this, Asimina. Yes.
Of course, yes, please.
Yeah. Paolo talks about the interactions of different segments of life. But one of the things that I find is when you say something is economic, or something is social, or something is political, or something is psychological, let me challenge you to find one thing in the world that is uniquely one of these. Okay? Any question you ask about anything, even a market, which is supposed to be the hallmark of economics, is not just a market. It is a social phenomenon. It is a political phenomenon. It is an anthropological phenomenon. Okay, so when you read, you should at least read some of the key contributions in other subjects. I understand, of course, your time is limited, so you can't read everything in different subjects, but at least some survey articles from other subjects to do it. So also I'd like you to think, is any phenomenon of any importance purely economic or purely social, whatever these words mean? I have not been able to find one. So if you can, please email me and I will think about it.
Well, I can certainly say that based on what I said before, truly there are no fixed boundaries. If you look around, there is no boundary saying that this is economics and this, or this is the economy and this is sociology or other types of relations. There is no such a thing. This was pointed out decades ago by Georgescu-Roegen before many others. So there are no boundaries. At the same time, when we talk about economics or about the economy, we do have an intuitive idea of what we're talking about. Roughly, we know the boundaries are fuzzy, but we discuss some issues more than others. And this is, I think, important because it allows us to know how to frame our argument. We know that there are some topics typical of sociology and that we can go and look for them there in that kind of literature. There are some issues that have to do with psychology and we can go and look for them in that literature. This is because, albeit fuzzy, the boundaries do exist. What is relevant is to conceive of these disciplines as related to aspects of reality which is systemically open. So I do consider myself an economist, but this does not mean that I have a specific area of expertise and all the rest is irrelevant, because all I have to say is as an economist. The emphasis is on the fuzziness of the boundaries rather than on the absence of boundaries.
Thank you, Paolo. Amitava, do you have something to add to this? I think we need 10 webinars just for this topic.
There was a moment where there was a moment where I had a feeling that Yaline had raised her hand.
I think it was a thumbs up, because I'm always looking at it. But of course, if the audience would like to, our guests would like to contribute to the discussion, of course, it is open. I always keep my eye on the participant list and the chat list just in case. But I'm also new to the Zoom thing, so if anyone would like to intervene, they are more than welcome. So I guess we can organize a great many webinars on these sort of topics. They are very interesting topics, and I'm sure they are very interesting to the young scholars who are trying to engage with something they are probably less familiar with because of the way the curriculum is organized at the universities, as Amitava mentioned earlier. They are more in the lines of more mainstream topics. So I guess now we could, slowly close the webinar. I would like to thank everyone, Paolo, Amitava, all our guests who graced us with their presence and participation today. And many thanks go to the association for this initiative. Myself, I have been with the association since I was a PhD student, and I found a very supportive and encouraging environment for young scholars, and we hope to continue this tradition. So it is time to bid you farewell. Stay safe, and depending on your time zone, good afternoon or good evening. Thanks again.
And thank you, Asimina and Paolo.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I guess that's a wrap.
Okay.
We can stop the recording now.